Tell me if you extend on that.
It's conditional. Fatigues necessary and sufficient. It's privacy versus validation.
All right.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go criteria. I'm going to go same one. There's no way you can possibly vote negative, even if they're winning the criteria arguments, even if they're winning cost-benefit analysis. There's no risk to dissent. There's nothing on case. There's not a single simulacrum of analysis as to why we have to have a plan. At that level, everything that they have on the impact level or on a link level is asserted. She's asserting that we have increased laws. She's reading one little card that says when you have increased laws, you increase litigation. It's a brilliant deduction, but it does not indicate that we have any burden. And when the only arguments that are on the underview and constructives and through the last speech say that you have to weigh impacts, there's nothing that binds us to a policy. And at that level, we're descriptive. We're critiquing the resolution. We're saying yes. In the status quo, people get mad. People are, the case cards will be clear. That's all I'm saying. On criteria first. Or off the big dump that we've been debating. They're indicating, first of all, there would be different perceptions. Equals everybody would perceive the same. First of all, we're indicating that the evidentiary standard is enough. We are indicating that you would not try to take our word for it or your word for it versus theirs. We're indicating the evidentiary standards on contention 2 indicate that people get pissed. It is within the context of the card. Second of all, the cards show perception. We would have the evidentiary burden, and at that point, those would be determining the cards. There's no objective standard, there's no subjective standard here. There's no guessing at the end of the round. We're indicating the evidence would stress that. They're indicating, next of all, that the one person is not enough. First of all, we're indicating this might be a burden of typicality, but it is not a burden of the case. Furthermore, we're arguing that there would be comparative advantage to the status quo. One person is enough. Furthermore, we're arguing that on balance, you can still weigh the affirmative. You can weigh how many people perceive that it's good versus how many people perceive it's bad. And if that's the ground she's wanting for, then they have plenty of it. But there's not a single card on case, not a single simulacrum of analysis on the dissent as to why anyone would ever perceive court clog. And at that point, they're not filtering through a definitional argument. Next to the point you would extend, which is completely dropped, the fact that the procedural correctness is prerequisite to any normative justification. You would determine first what the definitional boundaries are before you can even look at whether or not it's good or bad. The fact that any ground is irrelevant if we're arguing that grammatically, definition of quality of life would only subject you to a parameter which would evaluate perceptions. And at that level, that argument's conceded. There's not a word out of her mouth in the last speech. That is your parameter for the round. Down below, she says you decrease ground because everyone could be satisfied. You would never be able to determine. Wrong, King Kong. We're indicating that you would weigh the number of people that perceive one way versus the number of people that perceive the other way. Certainly in this objective ground. She says evidence equals that there is no harm, but I will take this out of contention 1. Furthermore, the first card in contention 2 says that in terms of quality of life, it is decreased. It is a specific card to the resolution. Next of all, she says you would punish them because they're not justifying the whole resolution, but she is conceding hasty in the last speech. Furthermore, this is definitional burden, which we're arguing, which is not an adverse position. We're upholding our grammatical boundaries. She says individual perception is different, but this is not the issue. We're not arguing in round perception, Ruby's perception versus our perception. We're arguing the perception that the evidence says the people get pissed when they get it. She says there's no objective determination, but there's no counter definition, and that's the only boundaries that we have. That would be perception. She says 1 is not just enough because it says in the United States, a little new for the 2 in our argument. Next of all, down below, she says, please extend that George indicates that we have a bright line. You would have to have a first-person objective, which would objectify it even more. She says in all the U.S., and this is subjective and perception equal different for everyone, but this is not taking out. We're not subjecting our opinion. We're not entering in the round. We're saying you look at the evidence. Please extend that we strike the balance between objective and subjective. They moved the definition out of the word, and they're not even providing a counter definition. Please extend that you would have to have it at the time of inquiry, at the time of the phone call, the time of the telemarketer, or the junk box. That's when you determine whether the quality of life is discreet. Please send the evidence on CBA indicating it is primitive and it is bad for decision making anyway. Furthermore, this is not relevant to the quality of life argument. Significant trend. A lot of lines, a lot of presses, nothing specific. They're saying no threshold. At what point? We're indicating 20 million people a day are bombarded. That is what we're arguing when we argue bombard. Please send Andrews says 100 people are second, and that it's 98% of the people dislike telemarketing. That is the second to last card in the case. Sure, that is enough for perception of the status quo. On contention 2. Please send the first card, Garo, and indicates that immediate equals slight, but in terms of quality of life, you have a significant degradation. Please send the second card, indicating that all these cards are assuming the bill, which has been passed without enforcement. Please send the card, the ugly card, indicating it is a nuisance. These people, the Holland's card above, says they drag people out of bed and they want to rip the butt off the wall. These are all specific to perception. But this is all we need. Please send the New York Times card, indicating that people are infuriated by these calls. Certainly these are all perception specific. Off the B sub point, please send the people, they tie 911 line up and they can't get the emergency calls. These are all perceived. They know that the telemarketers on the phone when they are trying to call 911. She says that there's no prognosis of the hospital. I don't think that this argument is new. She says you don't know if this is true, but these are empirical examples. She says look at the impacts in the interview, but we're indicating there's no plan. We're only a critique. And at that level, all we have to show is that in the status quo, it pisses people off and they perceive their quality of life to be degraded. On to the media, no, I'll just go into court club. Now she's saying only they go to court to begin speech. But she's dropping, first of all, that we're not proactive. She would have to win the burden somewhere constructed. So there would have to be an argument somewhere on your flowing this round that said why we'd have to do this. Second of all, we're indicating we're necessary but not sufficient critique for change. Indicating we do not change. Furthermore, we're arguing the right to privacy, which is a brand new argument, and 2 and R would be dropped. I.e., in the status quo, you'd have more of a violation of rights. There would be more ground for litigation within the status quo when you're violating their privacy rights. But there's no answer to this. On media collapse, it's irrelevant. I mean, I don't care about the flips. What we're arguing is that when you filter through criteria, perception or on balance, you would still be weighing whether or not people perceive, because that's the only definition you have in the ground. When you have arguments saying you would look at before normal considerations, the round is easy.